From NJ.com, this is Talk is Cheap, a New York Giants podcast. We're talking Big Blue football all year round.
Welcome on in, Giants fans, to episode 167 of the Talk is Cheap podcast right here on NJ.com. As always, I'm Matt Lombardo and joined once again by my friend and colleague Darryl Slater, who is back in the mix. The Giants certainly not in the mix in the NFC East, but this week in Philadelphia on Monday night is going to look a lot different for this Giants team, Darryl.
Good to be back, Matt. And while I was gone, it was more of the same for the Giants. Lost in Chicago 2-10. Returned, I did last week for the Packer game, another loss. Now they're 2-10, 8 straight losses, and they're at the point now where they are simply trying to just avoid some dubious history. If they lose Monday night in Philadelphia, they'll tie their longest losing streak in franchise history and then come home to play the hapless Dolphins. And yeah, they're still hapless, even though they've won a few games. And if they lose that game, then Pat Shurmur's got to be out the door in 10 straight losses. But
and there would only be 2 games remaining, so you don't really need to worry about how that impacts Daniel Jones' development versus... Correct. Like we talked about going into the bye week when they lost to the Jets, you still had 6 games remaining where you can make the argument that changing coaches at that stage could have really hampered Daniel Jones' development. You don't want him to have 3 coaches in his first 2 seasons. If you go to an interim head coach, whether it's Mike Shula or Thomas McGahee, you kind of take that off the table if you lose these next 2 games. And certainly the news of this week with Daniel Jones getting hurt with what Pat Shurmur's calling a moderate high ankle sprain, and all signs now point to Eli Manning starting on Monday. But with that being the case, there's really not a whole lot to evaluate with Pat Shurmur or Daniel Jones, especially if Jones doesn't play again. So 2 more losses will be 10 straight defeats. And Darryl, I think that's kind of the line of demarcation for Shermer is if he loses to the Dolphins, I don't see the Giants waiting around and having him coach against Washington the final week and then Philadelphia to close it out.
No, I mean, they shouldn't. That should be it. They should pull the plug at that point. I mean, the guy's 7-21 right now, and at that point he would be 7-23. Obviously, though, I mean, still, the Giants have 4 games left, and they are a bad team, obviously, so they could lose to any of their opponents. But none of these games are against teams that are, lights out. I mean, the Eagles have had their struggles this season. The Giants play them twice in the final 4 games, and then, of course, Washington and the Dolphins are both terrible. Again, the Giants are also terrible, so they could lose any of these games. But it's not a situation like last week against the Packers, where it seemed a foregone conclusion that the Giants were going to lose that game, and they did. This is a deal here where, could the Giants win out? I think I'd be really surprised if they did, but it's possible, I suppose. And if they do, then you never know with Pat Shurmur. But it's looking more and more likely that he's a goner, and it's looking fairly likely that Daniel Jones' rookie season is over, even though Pat Shurmur's left the door open, ajar, for him to potentially return this season. And that would be great if he could get another game or 2 for the Giants to get a better eval on this kid.
No doubt about it, because every snap that he takes, every game that he plays as a rookie, it's kind of laying the foundation for what you hope he does moving forward into his second year. We'll talk about that, talk about what his injury means, the fact that Eli Manning is returning, the impact of that on the locker room and certainly on the offense. But before we get into that, a little bit of housekeeping. Of course, if you like what you hear, we'd love if you would subscribe in the Apple Podcast Store, on iTunes, SoundCloud, Stitcher, Spreaker, and all of your favorite podcast platforms. You can throw us a like on YouTube as well. And we'd love if you would follow the show on Twitter. I'm at Matt Lombardo NFL. Darryl is at Darryl Slater. And of course, at Talk is Cheap NYG is how you follow the podcast. And Darryl, I think that the Daniel Jones versus Eli Manning impact on the offense is a good place to start here, because we could talk about how severely Daniel Jones is injured and the fact that he played through the injury on Sunday through the whole second half, the fact that he played through the injury at Duke and he only missed 2 games due to a broken clavicle, and all we hear about is how tough this kid is. But all signs are now pointing to Eli Manning playing on Monday night, and it's going to be fascinating to see how this offense changes, if at all, and if they're able to be any more effective against the Eagles in a defense that's really taken its lumps in recent weeks than they were earlier in the season against Dallas and Buffalo before Eli Manning was benched.
Yeah, I think the chances are slim that he comes back and lights it up and transforms this offense into something legitimate. I think it's probably slim, even against an Eagles defense that's overall a pretty good defense, but has not played particularly great lately. So, yeah, I think the chances are fairly slim that happens. he obviously does some better things than Daniel Jones does. I mean, Evan Ingram was pretty candid about that yesterday in the locker room, talking about the ball comes out in a more timely manner with Eli Manning than it does with Daniel Jones in terms of getting the ball out quickly and in the correct time, whereas Daniel Jones might hold the ball too long, he might rush the ball out. That's typical rookie quarterback stuff, and I thought that was good stuff from Ingram. But, that alone, I mean, doesn't guarantee that Eli Manning is going to transform this offense. The guy's 38. He hasn't played in 3 months. This is a totally new situation for him in his career. He's never done anything like this. So, I think the bar is low here.
Yeah, and kind of some cruel irony for the Giants. This is going to be the first time that they potentially have Golden Tate, Sterling Shepard, Evan Ingram, and Saquon Barkley all on the field together, but Daniel Jones is out. And you just look at that, and you can talk about the things that Daniel Jones has struggled with, and we've written about it, we've talked about it on this podcast, we both tweeted about it, that protecting the football, ball security in the pocket, all of those things are things he's going to have to improve on going into his second year. But I think the one area where, I don't know about you, Darryl, but I've been pretty impressed is he's made some really big-time throws. You look at the touchdown pass to Golden Tate against the Bears, you look at some of the throws in the snow, the touchdown pass to Sterling Shepard last week, some of the deep balls to Darius Slayton. Pat Shurmur said over and over that the one thing he and the Giants really like about Jones is he has a downfield mindset. And I don't think Eli Manning at this stage of his career has had that type of a mentality for the last couple of seasons. So it's going to be fascinating to see what is Darius Slayton's role in this scheme with all of those weapons back on the field. How often do they try to push the ball downfield? Or is this the game where Saquon Barkley has 11 or 12 catches on dump-offs behind the line of scrimmage, very similar to what we saw in the opener against the Cowboys last season, or week 2 last season, rather?
Eli Manning just isn't capable at this stage of his career of pushing the ball down the field on a consistent basis. So I think, this is a game where you're probably going to see a lot of short passes, a lot of reliance on Saquon Barkley in the running game and short passing game. And Pat Shurmur can talk all he wants about how the offense isn't going to be different. It's definitely going to be different. I mean, Daniel Jones gives the Giants a mobility factor that Eli Manning doesn't have and never really had to a large degree, especially in recent years. So, you'll see a different look from this offense, but I don't know if it's going to result in anything more spectacular than what you've seen so far. And that is crazy to think about, though. The big four offensively for the Giants in terms of their skill position players, they've all now been hurt this season at one point or another. And now with Golden Tate coming back from his concussion and Evan Ingram looking like he's going to be coming back from his foot injury this week, the big four all together, but not without their point guard or their quarterback, to use a cross-sport metaphor there, without their guy Daniel Jones. So who knows? I mean, the result of this game in a vacuum is not really, hugely important. I know it is for Pat Shurmur, but for a Giants team that is really out of the playoffs, I think a lot of fans are looking at this and saying, all we care about is the development of Daniel Jones, because it's a foregone conclusion that Pat Shurmur's gone. And I think that's fair.
And I think that's pretty accurate because, and I talked about this a little bit today in an interview that I did, you look at putting Pat Shurmur and Eli Manning back on the field together, whether it's for 1 game, 2 games, the final 4 games of the season, if we've seen the last of Daniel Jones, whatever the scenario is. There's really nothing to be gleaned here because Eli Manning has no future with the Giants unless he decides to come back on a team-friendly deal as Daniel Jones' backup. There's nothing, in my opinion at least, and I don't know how you feel about this, Darryl, but there's nothing as long as Eli Manning is playing that can be evaluated or gleaned about Pat Shurmur because Pat Shurmur's future, if it's not already been decided by this 8-game, potentially 9, 10, 11, 12-game losing streak to finish out the season, it's already been decided. At least, they've already either decided that wins and losses did not matter this season and they believe he's the coach to help mentor Daniel Jones and he'll be back, or they know that he's a dead coach walking, so to speak. There's nothing, in my opinion, that can be changed about Shurmur's future with Eli Manning as the quarterback.
Yeah, no, I think that's fair. I do think if they win out and Manning is with them for every game, I think that helps Pat Shurmur. I think that definitely helps him. Have John Mara and Steve Tisch made a decision yet? That's interesting to consider. I wouldn't think that they have. I think that they would take it all into account and look at it and look at everything, including the defense, including the progress of the young players on that side of the ball, and say, where do we go from here? It's unfortunate for Giant fans who were trying to gather together something out of the season, and for Jones himself, and really for the ownership as they tried to get a clear picture of Pat Shurmur. It's unfortunate that Daniel Jones isn't out there because you're not getting an evaluation of the coach based on who he's going to have going forward. And
right.
That's Daniel Jones.
And we don't know when they hired Pat Shurmur, Darryl, if they hired him, and we haven't had a chance to talk to Dave Gettleman about this, or John Mara, or Steve Tisch. We'll get to Tisch in a moment here. But we don't know if Pat Shurmur sat across from these guys in an interview and said, I can win with Eli Manning for this year and then develop the quarterback. And they said, great, you're on board. Or they saw what he did in Minnesota and thought, he's the guy that we want to develop Eli's successor. To me, that's the question that's going to be most fascinating. And the answer is going to be decided on whether he's back next year or not. Because if they believe that he's the guy to develop Daniel Jones, then if you're going to be smart about Jones' development, you bring him back. But if they thought that he was going to win some games, keep you competitive, and follow Dave Gettleman's misguided plan of winning while building, those results aren't there. So I think the only way that Pat Shurmur's back is if there's already been some sort of assurance that he's here regardless of wins and losses, and they just need to see progress out of Jones.
Yeah, because the wins and losses down the stretch are hollow, and to a degree, yeah, I think. But I think they also want to see, does he keep this team together? Can he keep the infighting that happened with Ben McAdoo away from this locker room? And so far he's been able to do that, Pat Shurmur has. So we'll see. I mean, I think one thing's for sure. If he loses the next two games, he's gone.
Yes.
If he somehow sprinkles in a couple wins here, he could still be gone. But
probably gone after week 17.
Yeah, but probably gone after week 17. So I would say the likelihood of Pat Shurmur being fired at this point is probably 90%. There's a little 10% sliver in there chance that he somehow manages to win out, manages to maybe get Daniel Jones back for a game or two, shows some glimmer of hope, make it 6 wins after 5 last year. I just don't see any way he's back with 4 or 3 wins, or 2 obviously.
Right.
And maybe if he wins 5 games again, but it's really hard to envision that. I think it's going to take 4-0, and I think it's going to take at least 1 or 2 of those games being with Daniel Jones, and to inject some last minute hope into this season, because Daniel Jones actually had been playing much better, and I'm sure you guys had talked about it while I was gone. He had been playing much better until that Packer game. The previous 4 games, he had been lights out. 11 touchdowns, 1 interception, quarterback rating over 100. And that's what you want to see from a rookie quarterback, a guy who improves as the season goes on. And he was doing that. He was unquestionably doing that. So that's a plus for Pat Shurmur. It's just that the turnovers have been too much of an issue with Jones.
It's tough to compete when you turn the ball over 21 times in 11 starts. It's very difficult in the NFL. Yeah. I don't care if you have a 15-year veteran quarterback or a rookie quarterback. Whoever you are, if you're turning the football over at that high and that alarming of a rate, you're not going to win many games.
And the defense has been non-competitive.
I agree.
And so that I understand he's an offensive-minded coach, but the totality of it all does not bode well for Pat Shurmur.
And I think that we got a little bit of a glimpse into what the Giants are thinking when Steve Tisch was honored at a charity event and he caught up with Bruce Beck of NBC4. And Bruce asked him his state of Dave Gettleman and Pat Shurmur and if he would give a vote of confidence. And Tisch basically came out and said that at the end of the season, him and John Mara are going to sit down and have a very honest conversation about the future and where this team is headed. That's not a vote of confidence in either one of those guys. And I have to wonder, Darryl, if both of these guys aren't completely on the hot seat. We talk all about Pat Shurmur, and you brought up an interesting point about whether he's lost the locker room, and you talk to players on and off the record, and these guys are playing for him. They still believe in him. They still believe he's a good coach, a good man, all of those things. But I do wonder if and when Pat Shurmur is fired, if it's not a sweeping house cleaning where Dave Gettleman is caught up in it too.
I think more likely than not Dave Gettleman stays, because the ownership has hitched its wagon to Dave Gettleman and his plan here. So it's awfully tough to fire a GM after just 2 years like that, especially in the year that he drafted a quarterback. I know the Jets did it in 2013, 2014. They fired John Idzik after 2 years. He drafted the quarterback Geno Smith the first year, but I think it's really unlikely that he gets fired. And I know Mike Maccagnan got fired it was after Sam Darnold's first year, but Maccagnan had longer. He had 15, 16, 17, and 18. He had 4 years to get that figured out. So,
and the Jets also fired him after a draft, which is
the timing
just
of it was insane. I think
unbelievable.
He deserved to be fired after the season. But obviously it's clear with how poor his drafts have turned out. But But I think to fire a GM after 2 years, even though a lot of Dave Gettleman's moves, yes, have been questionable, but to do it after 2 years, to do it after the year that he drafts a quarterback, that's why I think the Giants are going to look at this. John Maris, Steve Tischer are going to look at this and say, let's let Dave Gettleman have some input into this next head coaching hire, and he should have some input. He shouldn't make the decision unilaterally, of course. He hasn't earned that right. It should be a Maritish decision on the next head coach, but I don't think Dave Gettleman gets fired. I think as much as I disagree with some of the things he's done, I think it would be the wrong move to just hit the reset button now when you're already in midstream of a rebuild. Show some conviction and show some stick-to-itiveness with this GM. I mean,
the counter argument to that is that you've had 3 draft classes where you're picking in the top 6, and if the season ended today, and I think this is a pretty good chance, and again, I'm not going to be picking the Giants to win a game the rest of the year. We're just going to put that out there right now, barring some sort of injury for the opponent or some sort of massive turnaround in what we see from the Giants defense, and if the offense starts going around Barkley or whatever. I think 2-14 is where this team finishes, so if that's the case, you're probably picking second overall for the second time in 3 years. They're going to have over $60 million in cap space, which is probably around the 8th or 10th most in the league, so they have all the resources and wherewithal that they need. The shine is starting to come off of that 2018 draft with, Barkley being banged up and not really looking himself for much of the year. Will Hernandez regressing in a significant way, especially as a run blocker, missing assignments, not diagnosing what he's seeing from front sevens. B.J. Hill needing to be replaced in a trade by Leonard Williams, kind of disappearing. The lack of a big step forward from Lorenzo Carter. And then, of course, DeAndre Baker looking like a first-round bust and not really getting much from this draft class outside of Jones and a little bit from Dexter Lawrence. Darryl, I don't know that Dave Gettleman, given the resources that he's had and the draft picks that he's had, that you're not just further digging the hole the longer that you have a non-progressive thinking, non-analytics-driven general manager in that position with the amount of resources you have coming into this offseason.
The bottom line is the hire was questionable in the first place. But, look, I don't think it's a situation where Mara and Tish are going to look at it and bail this quickly on him. I don't. I think that they feel less cynically and a little bit different about Gettleman than we do from an outside objective perspective. And they obviously have a closer relationship with him than we do, so they have a little bit more loyalty there. But I think the hire was a questionable one from the get-go, just like the Shurmur hire one was. You hired a retread coach who didn't win in Cleveland. I know the talent level wasn't good, but he's obviously not a very good head coach. With Gettleman, you hired an old-school thinking general manager who, as you mentioned, is not really a progressive thinker and who has kind of whiffed on a couple of these. The jury's still out on Jones, and Saquon Barkley is a very good player when healthy. So let's just put that aside. But in terms of the middle rounds of the draft, where a GM really earns his keep. That's where Mike McCagnon couldn't do jack squat. In the middle rounds, he was terrible. And look, Jamal Adams, a really good player. And Sam Darnold, who knows, but anyone can pick. More likely than not, you pick in the top 6, you do it 3 or 4 times, you're likely going to get at least 1 or 2 good players out of that. So, the Giants picking high in the draft again this year obviously would reflect poorly on the record, but I mean, Gettleman had nothing to do with the fact that they picked high in 2018 in the draft. So,
but he did make the picks, and again, I defended the Saquon Barkley pick for a lot of reasons because you were dropping an elite running back into an offense with Odell Beckham when he was here, and Sterling Shepard, and Evan Ingram, and if you didn't like any of the quarterbacks in the 2018 class, I thought you take the best player, you try to goose the Jets into thinking you were going to take Sam Darnold, and you move back, get a couple picks for him, still get Barkley a little bit cheaper, but you'd have a ready-made offense to drop your future quarterback in 2019. But the moment that you pivoted and traded Odell Beckham Jr., and you look at the talent drain from this building the last couple years with the trade of Olivier Vernon and letting Landon Collins walk and on and on, trading Jason Pierre-Paul and never really adequately replacing his production. All of those things, in my opinion, go against Gettleman in the ledger, and I also think that by not sticking with Odell and keeping that sort of space-creating speedster at wide receiver, you kind of undid any of the goodwill or the good reasoning behind taking Barkley in the first place.
In the bigger picture, if you are going to trade away assets for draft picks. That's basically telling your fan base we're rebuilding through the draft, which is the way to do it. It really is. Draft and develop your guys. That's the way to rebuild through the draft. And then Mike Cagman said that, and I hate to keep bringing him up, but you're talking about
Howie Roseman, the
similar situation. You rebuild through the draft, but guess what you have to do? You have to draft good players. If you draft terrible players, the rebuilding through the draft doesn't work. It just doesn't. And I know the jury is still out on DeAndre Baker, who has had a pretty rough rookie year. It's really hard to thrive as a quarterback as a rookie in the NFL. Very hard to do. We'll see what Jones becomes. But you mentioned some of the other middle round picks who have been less than stellar. And Lorenzo Carter is a perfect example of a player who has not taken this next step in his second year and was at a major position of need for this team in terms of pass rusher and really hasn't delivered on what the Giants had hoped. And when you pick a guy in the third round, you think, you think we're likely to get a pretty
starting
good player, right? It can go either way in the third round. But that's where, like I said, good GMs separate themselves from bad ones. And if you can't find guys in the middle rounds when you're rebuilding through the draft, you're doomed. You're absolutely doomed. Go back and look at what the Jets did and I know it's, we're talking about two different franchises, but this team is rebuilding, just like the Jets have been trying to do for years now. The reason the Jets have been unable to get over the hump with these continual rebuild after rebuild after rebuild is because they can't draft for jack squat in the middle rounds of the draft. If you go back from 2008 to now, that's like a decade. Ever since they got David Harris in 2007 in the second round, and that was the Revis draft, they have not done anything in the middle rounds of the draft. That's where you build your roster, and that's why they're terrible, and that's why the Giants are in a really rough spot.
And to be fair, I did kind of a deep dive on Monday into why the Giants are where they are and why they've only won 10 games since 2017, the fewest of any team in the entire NFL. And Dave Gettleman doesn't deserve all of the blame. I think he deserves a lion's share of the blame. And the longer that you keep him, I think you're stunting the development of the roster, the talent that you're bringing in based on his track record of talent acquisition and kind of where you're going from here. But to your point, Darryl, go back and look at Jerry Reese's drafts in 2015, and typically it takes 3 to 4 seasons before you can fully evaluate a draft class or a rookie's career. Darryl, they don't have one player on the roster from 2015. That's 4 years ago. An entire draft class gone.
Same with the Jets.
That sets a franchise back 5 to 10 years. That's not being hyperbolic. It is so difficult to replace that kind of talent, and that's how you wind up going to 7 of 8 years without making the postseason by having those sort of whiffs.
Yep.
And go one more point on Gettleman and kind of tying it into Daniel Jones. His tenure is going to be remembered in large part by how Jones develops. If Jones winds up being a franchise quarterback and leads the Giants on Super Bowl runs or deep playoff runs, I think a lot will be forgiven in the long run. But if he's not, then that's going to make this tenure even more disastrous. But in the event that we've seen the last of Daniel Jones, Darryl, what are one or two things you think he needs to do better with next year?
Yeah, I think you covered it in something you wrote today, and I think obviously the turnovers, we know that. But one kind of more nuanced thing is he's got to take ownership of this team, and he's got to make this team his own. Sam Darnold, a quiet guy, just like Daniel Jones, stepped into the Jets this year and made the Jets his own. Obviously, they had hiccups and issues, from his mono to all these other things. Right. And his own talent, might be a problem too, and his own skills not being what the Jets had hoped. But I think Jones has to step in next year. Eli Manning won't be around. This is going to be his team. He needs to make this his team. He needs to cut down on the turnovers. He needs to build on the field awareness where he can spot those downfield opportunities in the way that he's done really well this year. I mean, that throw in the snow that we saw the other day against the Packers for the touchdown was a great throw. And he's made a few of those from time to time. But the decision-making has got to be better on some of these interceptions, and the ball security in the pocket has to be better.
Has to be.
I mean, 11 lost fumbles?
Yeah.
11 lost fumbles.
Yep.
And in 11 games. And because he lost one in the first game when he didn't start against the Cowboys. What a sign of things to come that wound up being. And,
And for the people out there rolling their eyes and saying he's a rookie and he's going to make mistakes, let him develop, here's the deal. He had a fumbling issue at Duke. This was part of the package with him. And again, I think if you asked me to rate where he is in terms of his chance to be a franchise quarterback, I think there's a lot to work with there. I think his deep ball accuracy is fine. I think that he is more than athletic enough. I think he has the temperament and the intelligence to want to learn and improve. Part of it comes down to coaching. And I think that along with the ball security and protecting the football and not turning it over and throwing interceptions, he has to get better at beating shell coverages, which teams threw at him ever since the Patriot game, and it's kind of been his kryptonite. And I think that he also has to do a much better job of getting the Giants in position with the running game and calling out what he sees from the front seven and getting him into better looks and audibling and all of those things. And you look at great teams, Darryl. You look at the teams with the great young quarterbacks, whether it's Patrick Mahomes in Kansas City going to the AFC Championship game his second year, what Lamar Jackson's doing, playing at an MVP caliber level in his second year, Jared Goff going to the Super Bowl in his third year, Carson Wentz going from a middling quarterback kind of where Jones is now to an MVP caliber season in 2017. These guys all take their biggest leaps from year one to year two, and there's a common denominator there. Look at these teams. You look at the Ravens, Hollywood Brown, speedster, deep threat wide receiver. The Eagles knew they needed to get more talent around Wentz. They went out and got Alshon Jeffrey and put him at wide receiver. The Rams
put him
traded
behind a really good line.
No doubt about it. The Rams go out and get Brandon Cooks, and they had Todd Gurley there, another speedy, game-breaking wide receiver. The Giants need to go get that talent and build it around Jones, but Jones also needs to do his part and improve over this offseason as well.
Yep. No doubt. It's just so interesting to see that the Giants being in the same position here that the Eagles were with Wentz going into his second year, and the Jets were earlier this offseason.
And the Jets went out and got Le'Veon Bell and Jamison Crowder, and they tried to build around him.
And what the GMs previously were, came before Joe Douglas, whether it was McCagnon, whether it was Idzik, what they forgot is you have to build an offensive line. And that's another area where the Giants are in a tough situation because the line is not good enough.
They have one player. I think Kevin Zeitler would start on 25 to 30 NFL teams. I don't know that I can say that about any of their other linemen.
No chance. You definitely can. And that's a problem. And because, is all the window dressing that the Jets went out and got this offseason, all the bells and whistles, Crowder and Bell, and they brought back Robbie Anderson in a restricted free agent deal, so he was back, and Darnold in his second year, and the quarterback whisperer Gase is the coach. They're terrible, and they're terrible on offense, and it largely, yes, injuries are a factor, but the offensive line is a problem. It's almost like you can see what the Giants are going to be next year. They're not going to have as much cap space as the Jets did in 2018 to work with, but you can see exactly where this is going next year unless they figure out some solutions on the line.
No doubt about it. Before we get out of here, Darryl, I know we haven't touched much on the Eagles game on Monday night and what the Giants can do to be competitive, but what are your just big picture thoughts on that game on Monday? How do you see it playing out?
I think it's going to be, I think I sent my pick in for that game to our, we submit them to the guys who gather up the picks for our staff. I think I picked the Giants to get just steamrolled, maybe 42 to 10. But that was before the Jones news came out. I don't know, man. They can't stop anybody right now.
Neither can the Eagles. Let's be fair. They gave up, I believe, 38 points to Miami on the road. So that defense is a sieve as well, just like the Giants.
Maybe 35-24 or something like that. It could be a fairly high-scoring game, considering how bad these defenses have been.
Yeah, I had the Eagles winning this one 31 to 23 before Jones got hurt. I backed that down to 33 to 16 as the final score with Eli Manning being in there. And you just look at the track record. Eli Manning's lost 5 games in a row. The Giants haven't won in Philadelphia since November 6th of 2016. Mike Garafolo pointed that out the other day on Twitter. So it's kind of a confluence of futility, if you will, and the chance to lose 9 games in a row, which I think is going to happen. I just think the Eagles, I don't think they're going to make the postseason, but I think they're the more talented team now on both sides of the football than what the Giants are. And talent matters in this league. The Giants right now, Darryl, no talent, poor coaching, no identity. That's how I look at this team right now. Poor coaching, no talent, no identity.
Other than that, Mr. Lincoln, that's hard to overcome. That's hard to overcome, and I don't think they overcome it on Monday. I think it'll be 9 straight losses. Maybe they snap the skid against Miami the following week, but who knows? Maybe in that game, people might be doing the old flying banners thing to get Shurmur out. I don't think they need to fly banners, folks. You don't need to spend your money on banners
banner planes
to convince ownership that Pat Shurmur needs to go, because the results of the games are probably going to take care of that for you.
Well, Darryl, it's Groundhog Day. Again, and I have a feeling we're going to be doing the same podcast next week, breaking down Pat Shurmur's future. Any parting shots or final thoughts before we get out of here?
No, I think that this thing is going to get ugly before it gets better in the big picture for the Giants. Like I said, there are no guarantees this team is in position to do anything next year. So, folks, just brace yourself for what's going to be a fairly long rebuild, because unless they fully commit to this, and they didn't fully commit to it, that's what it takes to go and get this thing done. In terms of a rebuild, you got to go through some pain, and that's certainly what they're doing right now, and I think there's a chance that this carries over to next year.
Big picture prediction for me, I think the Giants lose Monday night, and I think they lose to Miami. And if they lose to the Dolphins, Darryl, I think you and I are in Landover, Maryland, and it's either Thomas McGahee or Mike Shula who's the head coach of this team for the final 2 games of the year against Washington and the Eagles to close it out. That's my prediction. So he's Darryl Slater. Check him out on Twitter at Darryl Slater. I'm Matt Lombardo at Matt Lombardo NFL on Twitter. Enjoy the weekend, and we'll talk to you next week right here on NJ.com.